Hello and welcome to Rehab Reels, Conversations on Physical Medicine and Rehabilitation, hosted by Dr. Gwen Soa. My name is Andy Ziegler with the University of Pittsburgh and UPMC. I'd like to welcome everyone joining us today for a special presentation of a holistic approach to sports and spine medicine with Dr. Yetsa Tawakli-Wasornu. You may submit questions for our presenters through the Q&A feature on your screen. We will do our best to get to as many questions as possible during the allotted time. Our series host, Dr. Gwendolyn Soa, is the endowed professor and chair of the Department of Physical Medicine and Rehabilitation at the University of Pittsburgh School of Medicine, and is the director of the UPMC Rehabilitation Institute. She holds joint appointments in the departments of orthopedic surgery and bioengineering, and has served as a clinician scientist in the Department of Physical Medicine and Rehabilitation for over 15 years. Our featured guest this evening is Associate Professor Dr. Yetsa Tawakli-Wasornu. Dr. Tawakli is a board-certified physiatrist specializing in interventional spine and sports medicine treatments, helping people achieve high physical and athletic performance at all stages of life through holistic mind-body development and therapies. She is skilled in such innovative treatments as image-guided joint and spine injections, as well as regenerative treatments that help many athletes heal from injuries faster and better. When she works with patients, Dr. Tawakli often draws upon her personal experience as an athlete. She is a long jumper who represented the Ghana national team until 2016. She also represented Ghana as part of the 8-member medical committee of the International Paralympic Committee. As a physician scientist, she works with numerous global sport and rehabilitation organizations and is the founding director of the Sports Equity Lab, a research group delivering athlete-centered content that tackles inequities in sports, such as discrimination, social exclusion, disability stigma, harassment, abuse, and neglect using translational biopsychosocial science. Dr. Soa and Dr. Tawakli, thank you so much for being with us today. Dr. Soa, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Andy, and thanks everyone for joining. Those of you who are new to the Rehab Reels and those that are returning, it's wonderful to have you with us this evening. We are in for a special treat tonight with Dr. Tawakli. I'm so thrilled to have her share her work with you. You heard about some of the amazing accomplishments that she has had, but what I hope you will learn and take from this evening's discussion is, in addition to all of her own academic, personal and professional credentials that she brings to the table and her incredible experience, what that doesn't tell you is the impact that her work has already had and continues to have in this space. She's gathered a team of international collaborators around this important work that you're going to hear about tonight. She's a tireless advocate and provides cutting-edge and thought-provoking insight into sports equity and the care of all of the patients that we see that is so much needed. She's not only a masterful clinician, but she's also, as you heard, an elite athlete herself. So she brings a very unique perspective to this work as an athlete, as a clinician, as a scientist, as an educator, and all of that together is both powerful and impactful. So I know that you're going to leave tonight feeling inspired by the work that she is doing, and I hope in many ways empowered to make some changes in your own space based on what you learned from her tonight. Dr. Tawakli, please.
Thank you. Hello. So I really appreciate the introduction and the opportunity to share some of my work. I'm just going to share my screen. All right, so you should be able to see that, and yeah, let's get going. So this evening, I'm enthusiastic about this topic. I'm going to be talking about a holistic approach to sports medicine. The premise is really to understand and then hopefully start to think about addressing trauma and adversity in amateur and elite sport, not just elite. I have no conflicts of interest. So in the past couple of weeks or months, you've probably seen a headline like this, where disturbing cases of abuse cause incredible suffering among athletes of all genders in all sports. These stories are very often painted as emotional vignettes, where feelings outweigh facts. But in reality, the science of abuse far outweighs the emotional and maybe even political pull of it. So these are much more than sensationalized news stories. That is because every natural phenomenon really has a basic biology with mechanisms, risk factors, and prevention strategies, and there's no exception with abuse. We do know that childhood trauma and adversity are associated at the population level with a cascade of negative health outcomes in adulthood, such as cancer, depression, and obesity. That said, since athletes are a full part of society, trauma and adversity must impact their lives, their cognition, their socio-emotional well-being as well. That being said, this topic, interpersonal violence or trauma and adversity or abuse, the terms are somewhat interchangeable, which we'll get into later, though it can be uncomfortable for some people, really should be of critical importance to all sports medicine professionals in every country. So that concludes my little preamble, just to give you a sense of why this matters. In this talk, I'll describe three things. First, the current state of play and the science of interpersonal violence in sport. I'll talk about the empirical data and then some definitions, as I mentioned. Second, the consequences of trauma in sport on the athletes and on the community. And then finally, how we translate this research into community action through one of the programs that I've been really blessed to get going here in Pittsburgh. So let's start with the current state of play when it comes to interpersonal violence in sport. So in 2019, at the Play the Game conference, which is a nearly quarter-century long sports medicine conference, it's one of the best in the world, it was said in the concluding remarks, the single biggest threat to modern sport at any level of competition is abuse. Very powerful statement. Certainly the Larry Nassar abuse tragedy helped to catapult this reality to the forefront, but abuse or trauma and adversity has been debated in the literature for 30 plus years. So it's by no means new, but media has made it a new priority. What is known is that power imbalance anchors every form of interpersonal violence or trauma in sports. It's about much more than just gender and age. Additionally, a whole host of unwritten social contracts in sport and also in society make interpersonal violence especially common in sports settings. In sports, for example, organizational drivers of abuse include the grin and bear it culture, the walk it off mentality, the widely held belief that pain equals gain, and of course, some of the biases that exist in broader society, like sexism, racism, ableism, which is also known as disability stigma. These invariably show up in sports environments. Unfortunately, these biases and these unwritten social contracts actively encourage athletes, especially women, to downplay harms and violence against them and interpret them as normal. The best available data suggests a pretty grim reality. So if you just take a look at your slides here, you can see that up to 75% of youth athletes in the UK reported that they'd experienced psychological trauma. Prevalence of sexual harassment and abuse in elite athletes in Canada was anywhere between 19 and 92%, which is a very large number. That study was done by my colleague Gretchen Kerr at University of Toronto among a group of athletes that was 1,000 strong. Finally, on the left of your slide, you can see that globally, athletes with all sorts of disabilities are at between 2 and 4 times greater risk of bullying, physical trauma, sexual and psychological trauma. So the risk is great in this population. Now, when it comes to definitions, as I mentioned, I would mention a few. There's no real consensus definition yet, but you've already heard me swap out the terms interpersonal violence, trauma, abuse. Sports scientists are increasingly leading towards what other specialists have for a long time just called interpersonal violence, which means volitional acts, meaning intentional acts, that result in or have the potential to result in physical injury and or psychological harm. So that concludes the first part of the presentation. Coming now to the consequences of interpersonal violence in sport. Well, there are both athlete and organizational impacts. I'll first focus on the athlete impacts. Early summaries, like in the International Olympic Committee 2016 consensus statement, suggested a broad list of potential athlete impacts of abuse. I'll just highlight the bookends. Everything from dropping out of sport to committing suicide has been articulated as a consequence of this kind of trauma in the sports setting. Let me break it down just a little bit further. So a broader literature review reveals an even longer list of athlete impacts, which I'll break down by category. First, physical impacts, which include unplanned, unexplained physical injuries or illnesses, physical symptoms, such as feeling ill or nauseous before practice, changes in sleeping and eating patterns. Next, cognitive and emotional impacts. These include volatile mood states, so frequent and wide mood swings from euphoric down to depressed and back again in short periods of time. Changes in personality, so a docile personality might become aggressive and vice versa. Mental health disorders like anxiety and depression, low self-esteem, a sense of low self-worth and other cognitive effects. Symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, which are very stereotyped, which we'll talk about towards the end of the presentation. Disordered eating and frank eating disorders, and then suicide, either contemplated or attempted. Now to the behavioral impacts. Well, they include apprehension about attending team functions, rebellious behavior like skipping practice, not wanting to go to practice, self-harm, difficulty with interpersonal relationships, inside sport, outside sport, social isolation, sport dropout, and then they're more likely to dope or cheat. Material and performance impacts include the following: economic loss for those who are doing sports professionally, difficulty with academics that once came easy, and then performance decrements or a total indifference to sport. So these are the types of abuse, the types of impacts that affect athletes who may be abused in sport. So we'll continue to delve into the academic literature a little bit, but I do want to bring this material to life for you by letting you hear directly from athletes. There are a few short videos woven into this presentation. The first is from a group of Paralympic athletes in Ghana, and the second is a group of American gymnasts, all of whom were involved in a high-profile abuse case. So here's what the athletes had to say.
2016, I won 3 gold medals on the row. Raphael had 1 gold and a silver. So if I was not given the best para-athlete of the year, it was supposed to go to Raphael. Everybody knew that, like, maybe McLean deserved it or Raphael deserved it. And then it is given to a different person. When you are appreciated in that manner, then you can use that to encourage somebody. In an instance that you go all out, you give your best, and you deserve this, but at the end of the day, you are abused by not giving what you deserve. Sometimes if God does not come in, or you don't speak to some people who can encourage you, it will really demoralize you. Sorry, I'm being emotional, but it's really bad. It's really hurting. It really brings the sports that we are doing down.
And I've been abused in that form to sometimes to the extent that I feel like even sometimes going to training, I don't feel like going. People have stopped sports because of this, what it does to me. That's why I stopped.
I started to get anxiety after seeing all the news reports about him. I felt like I couldn't breathe and I would tremble in fear. I have nightmares about what happened and have troubles with sleeping. I've been put on anxiety pills just so I can function throughout the day. It's hard for me to trust people because of you. I started to get anxiety after seeing all the news reports about him. I felt like I couldn't breathe and I would tremble in fear. I have nightmares about what happened and have troubles with sleeping. I've been put on anxiety pills just so I can function throughout the day.
All right, so let's come back now to the research. A few members of my research group shown here, who should get total credit for this project because it was a big undertaking, conducted a systematic literature review on the topic. 6 databases were searched without a date limit. They used certain keywords like athletes, abuse, consequences. In total, they screened 5,152 studies. Ultimately, 442 underwent full text screening and 21 were ultimately included in their analysis. The first 9 studies are shown here. So I'll just try to animate some of this stuff. First, studies were published between 1992 and 2009, primarily in North America and Europe. Between 11 and 553, mostly female elite athletes were sampled. Sexual harassment and abuse defines different ways were probed for the most part. Qualitative methodology was most common, and in terms of the consequences, which is the last, sort of the fourth column on your screen, they were many. They included sport dropout, as you've heard, depression and anxiety, and emotional distress most commonly. So those are highlighted or underlined in the pink and in the blue. The next 10 studies of the 21 are shown here. The remaining two were not shown in this table, but I'll discuss them in subsequent slides. Starting from the left, studies were published between 2010 and 2019, primarily in North America and Europe again. Between 2 and this time 4,032 mostly female child athletes were sampled. Again, sexual harassment and abuse, defined different ways, was probed most likely, but actually we do see cyberbullying, psychological abuse, and physical abuse showing up here as well. In terms of the methods or study design, narrative accounts and surveys were the most commonly used methods. In terms of those impacts or the consequences, we again see sport dropout and emotional distress very frequently, but also now suicidal ideation, somatization or experiencing physical symptoms, and decreased work and athletic productivity were called out. So summarizing these study characteristics, most studies focused on the impacts of sexual harassment and abuse, not physical, not psychological, not neglect. The definition of trauma or interpersonal violence, it varied across studies, but it's really becoming more precise as the literature matures. The majority of studies were from 2 world regions, as opposed to all 6 of the world regions. And the literature consisted largely of descriptive case series, retrospective surveys, and cohort studies. Data on some of the most vulnerable athletes, athletes with disabilities, and other marginalized identities was actually absent. So in summary, there are numerous consequences borne by the athlete if they experience abuse. Now, this is not inevitable. These are trauma symptoms that could emerge in the setting of trauma, but they're broad. They do negatively impact athletes' bodies, minds, and spirits, as well as their training performances and their life aspirations. So the impacts can be broad and should be taken really quite seriously. So far, we have, as many people do, characterized the consequences of trauma as emotional damages to the victim alone, when in reality, these emotional damages are only a part of the story. All aspects of the victim's life can be affected, and trauma can be felt by members of the entire sports community in various ways, to varying degrees and for variable lengths of time. So a really key conceptual framework I'd like you to take away, if you take nothing else away, is the fact that interpersonal violence must be considered a community trauma that causes community-wide impacts. In this way, we don't risk underestimating its true toll. Again, I really wanted to find a real life story that would bring this material to life for you. And amazingly, I found this news headline from 2018. It seemed really perfect. As you can see, there are often 2 sides to the bystander story, and that starts with something like this: powerful, negative, unpleasant emotions like guilt when learning about trauma that an athlete has experienced. This news headline provides a great starting point for the idea of community trauma, which you can also think about as secondary or onlooker trauma. In this news story, the onlookers were parents, but they could be teammates, coaches, physicians, other family members, athletic directors, etc. So the reason for the secondary or onlooker trauma is rooted in the idea of empathy. It's a little bit of a complex phenomenon, but summarized briefly, empathy is the ability to place yourself in another person's shoes. There are specific neurocorrelates of empathy, meaning it lives in various places in the brain. But I think the key is that empaths are compelled sometimes by other people's cognitive and emotional experiences. Additionally, empathy is fundamental to the formation of pro-social or altruistic and moral behaviors. This is important because sports communities are highly empathic, meaning that they are incredibly close-knit. They involve a very high degree of empathy and strong shared emotional connections. Members of the athletes community, therefore, from their parents to their siblings to their teammates, are all susceptible to secondary or onlooker trauma. And this applies directly to witnessing another person's trauma or by simply learning about it indirectly. So closeness and empathy, those are pretty key concepts here. Secondary or onlooker trauma is amplified in intimate social settings. It happens a lot in sports communities. Parents, teammates, managers, and others, they really do feel strong connections to those who have been hurt. And this connection almost guarantees that they'll be impacted in some way by an athlete who's been intentionally harmed. So within the sports literature, just trying to bring it back to some of the data, this 2019 review, I think, made the point very well. This team of authors searched up key databases for papers examining life-disruptive stressors that led to post-traumatic stress disorder. If you take a look at the bottom three, which are bolded on the slide, you can see that athletes who have been sexually abused by sports personnel experienced PTSD, they themselves. Coaches who witnessed serious accidental athletic injuries, in this paper's case, it was a catastrophic trampoline accident, also experienced PTSD. And athletes who witnessed accidentally injured team members experienced PTSD. So you can see it's community-wide. Taking it back to something that was said by athletes themselves. Here's an example of where community trauma and the athlete's entourage can be catastrophic. Just take a listen.
I spent the years between 12 and 18 avoiding and detaching from my family. To my father, someone who makes such heinous false accusations is the worst type of person. His belief that I had lied seeped into the foundation of our relationship. Every time we got into a fight, he would tell me, "You need to apologize to Larry." It wasn't until I was about to leave for college that I took another chance at clearing my name. Larry Nassar's actions had already caused me significant anguish, but I hurt worse as I watched my father realize what he had put me through. My father and I did our best to patch up our tattered relationship before he committed suicide in 2016.
To summarize, in sport, empathic and catastrophic community impacts include the two that are bolded here. Additional signs and symptoms found in post-traumatic stress disorder, which are listed here, can also show up. They include nightmares, avoidance of activities or behaviors, feelings of re-experiencing the event, even if it happened to another, agitation, irritability, withdrawal, anxiety, persistent negative emotions, fatigue, illness, and this can all result from exposure to hearing about a situation, not just witnessing it directly. So we wrote about it in this article, Athlete Abuse Hurts Everyone, Vicarious and Secondary Traumatic Stress in Sport. And the key word is trauma. So I want to just emphasize here as we transition to this last part of the presentation, that these concepts don't just apply to interpersonal violence or abuse, right? Think back to 2017. When those of you who are from this area or who are avid Pittsburgh Steelers fans may have read in the Pittsburgh Gazette a headline like this, right? When Ryan Shazier was carted off the field. So broadly defined, trauma is any deeply distressing or disturbing experience. All trauma affects a person's entire community. In the same way, recovery from trauma requires a person's entire community. As we say in Africa, it takes a village. So this kind of brings us to this last little portion of the talk where we talk about translating some of these ideas into action. So this idea that it takes a village is something that Ryan Shazier knows very well. When he was going through his recovery, he leaned on faith, will, grit, and resolve, but also his family at home, at Heinz Field, at UPMC, to recover from his spinal cord injury. He also used the game of football when it came to his rehab. So bringing this all together, the program I developed here uses both of these elements, number one, community, and number two, sports, to help newly injured spinal cord patients transition from hospital to home and get back to living their best lives. The program is called 3D Sports Rehabilitation Pittsburgh, or 3D SRP for short, because everyone likes a very short, easy to remember program name. But we take an individualized, sports-based, and family unit approach to rehabilitating patients and their families together. So you get those two components in there. I think they're exceptionally important. The program targets spinally injured or young adults at or above the age of 15. They've got to have an interest in sports, any sport, excluding esports. You got to physically move more than just the thumbs. Eligible patients will be medically stable, have recently completed acute inpatient rehabilitation, so they're transitioning from hospital to home. Patients and their families will have a personal interest in some kind of physical movement, whether it's observing it or playing it. And they should be able to safely participate in physical exercise. Potential outcomes, which we hope to be able to document, include increased physical, mental, and social health for the patients and their families, increased quality of life for patients and their family unit, reduced compassion fatigue among caregivers, and then reduced sedentariness and mental social detachment for the patient. So this concludes my presentation. I just want to thank everybody for their kind attention, and I'll be happy to take any questions that come up. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Twockley. That was magnificent and thought-provoking as always. So while people are thinking of their questions, and feel free to post in the Q&A section if you have some questions for Dr. Twockley. Maybe I'll start off. So you ended with talking about the 3D SRP program, which is an exciting new program that you've developed here. Can you tell us a little more on who's working with you on this and how it's developing?
Sure, absolutely. So I have the best program manager in the world. His name is Michael Grafner. He started at University of Pittsburgh, because he's hired at University of Pittsburgh, January 1st. And he is a former head diving coach down in West Virginia and an elite athlete himself, but he's also been part of these huge sports communities that really require collective strength, but intentionally. So he's been a real asset to me and also to the program. And so he's the first person I'll just call out because he's phenomenal. And I hope everyone gets to meet him. Michael Grafner, you can look him up. We're also working with a great team of physicians who were involved in Ryan Shazier's case, actually. So Amanda Harrington, who is one of the best doctors I've ever met, actually. She's exceptionally skilled and a beautiful person, gracious, committed, and wonderful. So she's agreed to help us a little bit as an advisor. So too has David Okonkwo, brilliant neurosurgeon who's also a Nigerian like my mom. So I'm very proud of that fact. So it's been a really good team so far, and we're slowly growing. We have Matt Berwick, Ashley Molinaro. They're at the Disabilities Resource Center in our squad. We've just been slowly but surely, sort of organically building our squad. So these are the folks that we've got hooked for the for now, and hopefully that'll continue to grow.
It's an incredible team, absolutely. So as you were talking about it, and you were talking about the powerful and under-recognized impact of the community impact of trauma. And certainly this is something that you've incorporated really well into the vision and mission of 3D SRP. How do you think we as a community can do a better job helping the community impact? I mean, usually if we're interfacing with an individual, whether that's as a coach or a trainer or a physician, we're not necessarily seeing that whole impact. How do we have an effect on this and help the entire community that has interacted with this individual also heal?
I love that question. Like with so many things, I think it starts with recognition, acknowledgement, and just calling it out. So, if you are in a scenario where you're taking care of somebody who's experienced trauma, and again, that's any deeply distressing event, from abuse to a spinal cord injury, which could change the way you interact with your body and the world. I think looking to those in the entourage, the family, the children, the parents, and asking them, how are you doing? I know this can be very distressing for all that are connected to this person, because we're social beings as humans. And so I think people really, they appreciate when you ask them, how they're doing, and acknowledge verbally and take time to engage them and understand how they're doing on their healing journey. So beyond just acknowledging it, calling it out, making it plain, I think we can then start to lean into some of our community resources, those for whom trauma care and trauma-informed care is a part of their regular scope of practice, like trauma-informed psychologists, psychiatrists, social workers, and all the community resources that we MDs and DOs may not have training like they do. But I think it starts with just acknowledgement. It may sound cliche, but it goes a long way. We have a lot of times I'll have patients, come in with their spouses or their family members, maybe a daughter or a nephew. Recently, I had a great nephew who looked like he was my age. Turns out he was 15. I'm not sure why he looked so much older than he actually was. But after I stopped interfacing with the patient, I just turned to him and said, what are your concerns? This must be really hard on you as well. And he's so appreciative. He had a lot to say. It brought in a whole nother perspective that obviously the patient, just because he's living in his own body, may not have acknowledged or recognized. And I think he just appreciated being drawn into the conversation, because when the patient leaves, they're going home to their family. And that's who we need to also account for in our care, in our thoughtfulness, in our intention and attention.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the family unit, the friend unit, everyone surrounding this person is going to have such an important impact, and that acknowledgement that they've been impacted too, I think can actually help not only the healing relationship, the therapeutic relationship that you're developing with that family, but hopefully open the door for their conversations within the family.
And we'll take it one step further. It could also potentially impact and improve outcomes.
Yes.
Right. So if we're all pulling together in the same direction, then recovery and the post-traumatic growth on the other side of that could be optimized. That's my hypothesis anyways. So if our trauma is collective, then our triumphs can also be. That's the the mantra sort of always floating around the back of my mind.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So it can create a win-win-win, right? To be
correct.
Something terrible that has happened, but create multiple layers of wins that can.
Trifecta.
That's fantastic. As clinicians, you alluded to this, right? So clinicians are typically not trained in this, right?
Correct.
They're not trained in who to pull in, how to get the resources, how to get the help, but also just how to recognize some of the signs. And some of your research has really drawn this out, right? Called this out. Like there are signs. There are, just like any other thing that we're looking for as clinicians, there are signs that you can cue into. How do you think clinicians could do a better job kind of getting that into their working knowledge when they're interacting with patients and their families, or athletes if they're doing coverage or things like that?
Okay, so I'll answer the question directly, and then I'm going to take a step back and just articulate the fact that it shouldn't all rest on our shoulders, and we shouldn't take it on like that. But directly, as I mentioned, there is that list, right, of physical signs / impacts or consequences, cognitive and emotional, behavioral, material performance. So I think the most important thing is to always be as observant as we should be as clinicians. And when there's a change, take it seriously. When your intuition tells you something's not quite right, listen to that intuition, right? And so that starts with, however, really knowing your athletes and knowing them as people, caring for them, showing up and being fully mentally and emotionally present to those you're caring for. So you can notice changes, and you can notice differences in their behavior, in their cognition, in their performance, in their interest in sport in and of itself. So I think that's the first thing. Just, familiarize yourself with those very simple 5 category consequences at the athlete level of interpersonal violence, either in the home or in the sports context. So that's the first thing. But I just want to walk that back just a little bit, because I think we clinicians we feel sometimes unfairly so that we really should be able to do it all. And we need to operate within our scope of practice. That's a safe and responsible way of practicing medicine. So also recognizing that we need to avail ourselves of the community resources where this is within the routine scope of practice. That's a very important factor as well. So referral sources, referral algorithms, of course, I think they need to be developed more at the department level to make it, systemic, or the institution level to make it systematized. But it's something to always keep in mind as a critical step to get our athletes on a healing path. If in the setting of having experienced interpersonal violence in particular. But then I also want to mention a few more things. Again, this answer can kind of go on and on because I just keep kind of like going upstream, you know? So we also have to have a culture where there is permissiveness and a sense that this matters and should be taken seriously. That's kind of the idea of trauma-informed care and trauma-informed approaches. Trauma is ubiquitous. Everyone's experienced some kind of deeply distressing events. It's just part of humanity. That being said, it's so ubiquitous that we should take it seriously as clinicians, and it has so many physiological impacts that it is going to affect our athletes, not only their minds and their bodies, but also their performances. So coming at it any which way, no matter what your motivation for being in sports, it should be something that is taken seriously. But institutions, cultures, sports settings, locker rooms, sports medicine clinics, they have to take it seriously. So kind of creating that culture where it's considered important and worth attention is important.
Yes.
Hopefully that answers it. I could literally go on for a couple more minutes. Sorry about that.
No, that's exactly what I was hoping to hear from you, that the broad impact, the need to use your resources, but also the need to educate. And I think that's why the work that you're doing is so important, because getting this word out and disseminating this information, raising people's awareness, raising people's antenna, right, that these things are out there and need to be, as you point out, taken more seriously than they have been, perhaps.
You know, there's one more resource I want to mention. So there is the Adverse Childhood Experiences Framework that has been well vetted since the late 1990s. They have so many resources that are free and available online. And so if you just search up ACEs, capital A, capital C, capital E, with a small s, there's an entire framework that's been elaborated for almost decades now. There's a very short checklist one can use, the ACEs questionnaire. They've kind of developed a few more over the years. One of them is called Pearls. It's very interesting. It kind of looks a little bit more at household dysfunction, not just interpersonal violence. So familiarizing yourself with that kind of material, it's freely available online, can also seriously help. And it was developed in a clinical context. And so it could easily be incorporated, for example, if you were to harness informatics into a clinical workflow. So these are some ideas where we're not trying to reinvent the wheel, but we're trying to leverage existing resources that are clinically applied.
Right. Are there other resources we should be making our trainees aware of, or other opportunities that they can tap into?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that. So my friend Dr. Allison Schrader, and you, Dr. Soa, nudged us in the direction of tapping the U.S. Center for Safe Sport. And they've got a series of trainings that can be made available to clinicians, sports medicine doctors, if you're on the pitch side, on the field side, on the track side, in the locker room, or in your sports medicine clinic. So I know we started to implement that in our department, and I imagine that could be scaled throughout various sports settings.
Yeah, very doable, right? Very doable.
Totally doable. 30 minutes to 45 minutes is just like an onboarding process.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. So I'll go to some questions from the audience. And the first one is, what's the best approach to having a dialogue with your patients who may not be as open about their trauma? How do you?
Yeah, that's the question. Yeah, that is such a good question. So the trauma journey it's important to respect that there are phases to it. And so persons who are not as open about their trauma may not be ready to be. That's the first point I'll make. So I think patient-directed pacing and patient-directed care is a huge part of trauma-informed care. It's rather than this kind of paternalistic top-down approach. You should really let the patient lead the way when it comes to pace, disclosures, et cetera. So that's the first point I'll make. A couple of my colleagues out in California, where this material has been really, really refined since ACEs was born in California, they said that over the decades they've been doing this work, they've learned you cannot force these symptoms and these issues to be disclosed when the person is not ready. It could actually do more harm than good. So that's one thing just to keep in mind. But the second thing is, I think there are ways we can incorporate anonymity into our clinical workflow. So for example, anonymized patient-entered questionnaires can be incorporated where people might feel more comfortable either answering these questions at home on their own, on their cell phone, in the waiting room, where they're not being forced to verbalize. I'm a victim of such and such. It's very destabilizing to go from being a Herculean athlete to stating to yourself and then to somebody else, actually, I'm a victim. It's a destabilizing sort of identity, moment of real identity shift. So it's not easy. And so we could skirt around that by, I think, usually leveraging informatics in that way. So that's another conversation about clinical workflow, but it's a little tip. And then finally, simply creating a culture where there is, the highest level of trust, transparency, reliability, so that whenever that person is ready, it's easy for them to talk to you. And that takes time. You don't build trust in a couple encounters. You build it over time. You build it by being consistent. You build it by coming through, by doing what you say you were going to do, by showing up maybe a little early and staying a little late, maybe by doing that additional injection that you didn't have the plan to do because you don't want them to be in pain. These types of things, I think just building that environment where they know that they can rely on you no matter what, that environment where there's transparency and trust is much more conducive to trauma disclosures, if that's the aim. Yeah. So those are the three things I'll say about that. But it's not like a ACL rupture where it's hard for the athlete to hide. And athletes too, they don't always like to admit that they have an issue. I mean, look at the concussion reporting rates, disclosure rates, they're low for the most part. If athletes can hide injuries, sometimes they will, depending on the setting. So
indeed. Well, it really highlights the importance of the longitudinal relationship.
Correct.
That relationship building that you have with the patient, their family, their circle that can help
be there for them, be someone that they can rely on.
Yeah. So another question is, with the increased recognition within the sports world, do you know if there are actionable things that have been taken on in the sports world to help manage widespread abuse?
Yeah, that's a phenomenal question. Yes, there are actual things. So in the international sports world, FIFA, which is the Global Soccer Authority, has instituted what they call a Guardians program. They are also in the process of building an independent institute for sport safeguarding, which is the term they use more internationally than in America, to help not only prevent, but also receive disclosures and then allow for redress or healing post interpersonal violence. So that's one sort of major, 65,000 soccer players out there. So it's a huge global sport and a huge global movement. Similar to the IOC, International Olympic Committee, they've also developed a couple of programs, including a new certificate for safeguarding officers in sport. They can be learners from all over the world, and they're being skilled to be able to, in their local sports contexts, whether it's a Trinidadian rugby league or an American basketball league or an American youth football league, be able to disseminate some of these principles in their sports context. So build the culture locally and leverage some of these, some of the healing, the resources around the community locally. So there are a few initiatives that are pretty big. Again, those are access online. Many of the materials are free. Not all, because a lot of these are profit-making institutions, but many of the materials are free.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, so in addition, there was a comment, in addition to a wonderful presentation, that you mentioned this, but the approach could expand to really all of our practice. And I think these lessons that you're talking about really go beyond even interacting with an athlete, right? But really all of the patients that we interact and care for, these lessons and these skills can be really impactful. So another comment and question from the group. I think this is so important. Rehab is already so much of a team sport where we take pride in treating the whole patient. So integrating this holistic care makes sense, and how to optimize. Where can we go to learn more about this work?
Yeah, I mean, I think I just want to make a comment about Rehab, just to shout out our entire department and our work and our field. I think physical medicine and rehabilitation is the ideal spot for this conversation. I've been shouting this from the hilltops for about 5 years now. I think sports medicine professionals, generally speaking, writ large, are phenomenal human beings, specifically when they're physiatrists, because we have training that really involves team approaches to care. It's just in our DNA. Also, the athletes most vulnerable to these types of harms happen to be those with vulnerable identities, for example, or identities that have been made vulnerable by society, like persons with disabilities, for example. So agreed, rehab is a great spot for it. First, trauma-informed care, trauma-informed approaches can be read about on sites like Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. They've got a huge literature on that. As I mentioned, the Adverse Childhood Experiences framework. They've got a beautiful site with various points of entry, whether you're a clinician or not. So just doing some digging around those sites, I think is really a great starting point. There are, of course, Google Scholar, PubMed, literature searches. The literature on this specific, like this very particular topic is really exploding in the past 2 years. We've seen it go from something like 90 articles to almost 200. And so it's really, really, really ticking up, potentially due to some of the media coverage as well. So I would start with those. Definitely the Adverse Childhood Experiences framework, I think, is a brilliant guidepost. And it's very easy to follow, easy to understand as well.
Yeah, those are great resources and very accessible for people. So that's great. So you were talking a little bit about in the clinical encounter, how to develop that trust and develop that partnership so that people are comfortable disclosing, sharing, talking with you about trauma. What about on the research side? So we have a lot of issues in the research world of mistrust. And I wonder what your experiences have been or what your recommendations are about how we should be approaching things, the methodology a little bit differently, because it's not going to be as simple as, well, let's just recruit patients or participants and give them a survey and that's going to give us the answer. So what should we be thinking about differently to pull this out?
That's a very good question. I think research methodology in general could benefit from a leaning away from quantitative methodology writ large. So I think not just biomedical science, but many types of sciences, and specifically in sports science, there's a bias towards quantitative research. I think it gets a little bit more street cred, it's a little bit more respected generally. And interestingly enough, however, quantitative work tends to be impersonal. It always also tends to be a little algorithmic and bureaucratic and procedural. I think it also tends to be researcher directed, so it's top down. These are all the conditions that minimize the chance of a personal connection and a transparent, trusting relationship where there's meaningful interaction. So as obviously what I'm leading to is qualitative, on the other hand, tends to be patient or participant directed. People are saying what they believe in their own words, at their own pace, in their own space, at their own time, right? They're directing it. They've got agency. Number two, it's less procedural and bureaucratic and more personal. You have more of an opportunity to develop a little bit of a rapport between the researcher and participant. And then finally, just in terms of what it encourages, I think quantitative work generally, and this is not all, but sometimes, it does kind of encourage one-dimensional, simple responses. You sort of go through the survey answering, and then there's a free text box at the end, which maybe respondent fatigue has kicked in. You might just say, great survey, thanks. Whereas a multi-dimensional, multi-layered, nuanced data set comes from qualitative research, where patients or participants just talk and the conversation goes where it goes. It's much more true to the human lived experience. It's a little messier and a little bit more organic. So I think generally speaking, when there's a new topic, people tend to lean in the qualitative direction or mixed methods in order to first build the evidence base. Once that's built and we can identify themes or areas of high priority from that qualitative work, then quantitative tools can be developed more intelligently in an evidence-based way in any field, in any topic. So specifically with this one, because it's so new, we almost have to start with qualitative, but I think it's a little bit more personal, less bureaucratic. It gives an opportunity for the participants to direct the conversation and direct the list of priorities that we articulate in our publications.
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic way to look at it. I think it's about learning what we don't know rather than trying to prove what we think we know.
Correct.
So
Yeah.
opening that door to something that we might not have created a hypothesis around at all.
Yeah, which is okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, that's the best kind of research, right?
I think so.
Learning really what gets at the heart of what's going on. So yeah, that's a fantastic way to approach it. The other piece of the getting quality information that is actionable is developing the trust in that community. And this is, when we talk about health equity in general, it's about, if there's someone coming from the university center into the community and trying to either do some research, have an impact, have an initiative, there's always a bit of mistrust, right? What's the angle here? What do you think we need to do better, both on the research side and the clinical side, in developing trust in the sports equity community?
That's a very good question. I think, well, you know what I found? I found that, many of us wear multiple hats just because of our life experiences. And very commonly, and this has been proven in different types of studies, participants can relate to practitioners who have similar life experiences as them. So being an athlete sometimes helps when you're treating athletes, having competed, et cetera. So I think the first bit is to, make sure that, or it's insofar as it's possible and it relies on you, try to work with communities that you're from. And not necessarily in terms of your cultural experience, but in terms of your lived experiences, like in a sports team, for example. I think athletes, especially like when I meet track athletes, they really somehow, there's just that innate, inherent connection that is made. You cut through a lot of the fat, you get past a lot of barriers just with that recognition, like game recognize game, I recognize you, I know what you're going through. And I think that helps build a rapport that's slightly automatic. So that's the first thing. So if it's possible to really follow some of your experiences in the way that you do your work. If it's not possible, no worries. One can leverage community resources. And so looking to athletic trainers, youth coaches, sports medicine physicians who are in the community, may not have the huge academic resources that we have, but are really close to our patients. Maybe they've done a handoff to us. We can bring them into the conversation and include them in the care team with as equal respect as what we have. I think that it can help an athlete feel like, okay, I know at least someone in this group has my back 100%. So I'm more likely to trust the whole group.
Yeah.
And so I feel as though really giving other persons who are not necessarily highly academic like we are, just as much respect and equal value on the research team or clinical team, or research clinical team, can help overcome some of those trust barriers you described.
Yeah, that's great. And such an important piece of this as well for us to move this initiative forward. So I know we're coming up upon the top of the hour, and this has been such an incredible discussion. I hope that everyone has enjoyed this as much as I have and learned from your wisdom, and is able to take some of these nuggets and incorporate them into their own work, whatever that may be. So this has been fantastic. Thank you so much for the work that you do. Thank you for sharing it with us tonight. And I'll turn things back over to Andy to close us out.
Thank you.
Well, that is all the time we have this evening. And I want to thank you, Dr. Soa and Dr. Twockley, for such an informative presentation and discussion. For anyone who had a question we were unable to get to today, or if you would like to learn about ways to support the Department of Physical Medicine and Rehabilitation, or Dr. Twockley's 3D SRP program, please contact me at raz37@pitt.edu. Dr. Soa and Dr. Twockley, thank you again. And to everyone who joined us, please be on the lookout for future sessions of Rehab Reels and have a good evening.